You know what is fascinating? Most organizations don't fail because they make bad decisions. They fail because good decisions die quietly after the meeting. A leadership team spends 3 hours discussing priorities. Everybody agrees, everybody nods. Somebody says, great meeting. And then absolutely nothing changes. The same delays, the same confusion, the same firefighting, the same repeated conversations. It's like watching Avengers Endgame, where the entire team assembles dramatically. And then nobody actually fights Thanos. The strategy exists, the intent exists, the alignment appears to exist, but execution, gone. And here is the dangerous part. Most leaders think the problem is communication. So they schedule another meeting. They send another email. They create another PowerPoint. But what if the real problem is something deeper? What if clear decisions still don't get executed? Because clarity alone is not enough. That is what we are unpacking today. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you the hidden organizational gap that silently kills execution after everybody agrees. Because once you understand this, you never look at decision making the same again. You never look at decision making the same again. Let me start with a misconception that exists in almost every organization. Leaders believe if the decision is clear, execution should naturally follow. Sounds logical, but organizations are not machines. They are cognitive systems. And this is where most execution breakdown begins. And decision can be clear at the leadership level, while remaining psychologically unclear at the operational level. That distinction changes everything, because clarity in the boardroom does not automatically become clarity in behavior. Let me give you an example. Imagine a CEO announces, customer responsiveness is now our top priority. Simple, it sounds clear, sounds direct, but immediately invisible questions begin forming inside the organization. Does this mean we respond faster even if quality drops? Can teams bypass approval structures? Who has authority to solve escalated issues? What happens if responsiveness conflicts with cost controls? What metric matters more now? Suddenly, the decision that sounded crystal clear becomes operationally ambiguous. And when ambiguity enters the system, execution slows down. Not because people are lazy, not because they are resistant, but because the organization lacks cognitive alignment. That is the real issue. That is the real issue. Most companies focus on communicating decisions. Very few focus on translating decisions into aligned interpretation. And organizations don't execute based on what leaders say. They execute based on what teams feel safe acting on. That's a completely different thing. A very different thing. Here is something most leaders never notice. The smarter the team, the more likely they are to hesitate after a decision. Because intelligent teams see complexity. They see risks, they see trade-offs, they see unintended consequences, which means if decision boundaries are unclear, smart people slow down to avoid making costly mistakes. That is why some organizations look busy but move painfully slow. Everybody is waiting for invisible permission. And the irony, leaders interpret this hesitation as lack of ownership. But often it is actually lack of execution certainty. Think about the movie Inception. The entire film revolves around uncertainty about reality. When people are unsure which layer they are operating in, movement becomes cautious. That's exactly what happens inside organizations. People hesitate when they don't understand, especially when they don't understand what decisions they truly own, what risks are acceptable, what trade-offs leadership is willing to tolerate, what happens if something goes wrong. So instead of acting decisively, teams default to more meetings, more approvals, more escalation, more alignment sessions. Not because they love bureaucracy, but bureaucracy feels safer than ambiguity. And this is critical. This is critical because execution breakdown is often a risk management behavior. Let us sink in. Sometimes organizations aren't slow because people are incapable. They are slow because the system unconsciously punishes autonomous action. That changes how you solve the problem. Now, there is a hidden gap most organizations never diagnose correctly. There are actually 4 levels between decision and execution. Most leaders only focus on one. Let me show you. Level 1 is decision. This is where leadership says, we have decided. Most organizations stop there. That's where they stop. But execution doesn't happen at decision level. It happens downstream. Level 2 is interpretation. This is where teams subconsciously ask, what does this actually mean for us? And here is the problem. Different departments interpret the same decision differently. Sales hears urgency. Finance hears caution. Operation hears process pressure. HR hears change. Same decision, different realities. Then comes level 3, prioritization. This is where teams ask, what should we deprioritize now? And this is where many clear decisions die. Because organizations love adding priorities without removing competing ones. So teams experience strategic overload. Everything becomes important, which means nothing becomes executable. Then comes level 4, reinforcement. This is the most overlooked layer. Organizations do not execute based on announcements. They execute based on reinforcement systems. They don't execute based on announcements. organizations execute based on reinforcement systems. And this is what gets rewarded, what gets protected, what gets punished, what gets escalated, what gets ignored. That is what shapes behavior. A company can say, we want innovation, but if every failed experiment gets criticized publicly, nobody innovates. A company can say, we empower employees, but if every decision requires executive approval, nobody feels empowered. Organizations always reveal real priorities through reinforcement patterns, not slogans. Not slogans. And this is where my organizational cognitive alignment model becomes powerful. Because execution improves when decisions, interpretations, priorities, and reinforcement systems all point in the same direction. That is alignment. Without it, even brilliant decisions collapse. Even brilliant decisions collapse. This is where many leaders accidentally make things worse. They notice execution problems, so they increase communication. More town halls, more updates, more presentations, more leadership memos. But information volume does not create alignment. In fact, sometimes it creates more confusion. Because communication without decision architecture becomes noise. Let me explain. Imagine giving a football team a motivational speech every single day without clarifying who defends, who attacks, what formation they are using, what strategy changes under pressure. Eventually, motivation becomes irrelevant because confusion beats inspiration every time. And this happens constantly in organizations. It happens constantly in organizations. Leaders overestimate the power of messaging while underestimating the power of operational design. Execution is not mainly a communication problem. It is an organizational cognitive problem. Teams need shared decision logic. They need to understand when uncertainty appears, how do we think? That is the missing piece. High-performing organizations standardize decision principles, not just goals. That distinction matters. That distinction matters because goals tell people where to go. Decision principles tell people how to move when conditions change. And conditions always change. Conditions always change. That's why military organizations emphasize command intent, not micromanagement. Because in dynamic environments, centralized decision making becomes too slow. Organizations that execute consistently create decentralized clarity. That means teams understand what matters most, what trade-offs are acceptable, what risks are tolerable, what outcomes define success, without needing constant approval. That is real execution maturity. Let me repeat that. That is real execution maturity. Now, let's talk about one of the most misunderstood words in business: accountability. Accountability. Most organizations think accountability means people should do what they were told. But true accountability requires three things: clarity, capacity, confidence. And most companies only provide the first one, clarity. Maybe. Here is what happens. Leadership makes a decision, then assigns accountability. But the people responsible, they don't control the necessary resources. They don't have authority to resolve conflicts. They don't know which trade-offs leadership prefers. They don't feel safe making judgment calls. So accountability becomes performative. People appear responsible without being operationally empowered. And eventually, execution stalls. That is why some organizations are full of highly competent people who still underperform collectively. The system itself creates hesitation. It's like asking someone to drive a Formula One car while blindfolded, and then criticizing them for going too slow. Speed without visibility feels dangerous. So teams compensate with caution. I think this is important. This is very important. People rarely resist execution. They resist unclear consequences. That changes how leaders should think. Because execution improves when organizations reduce cognitive friction, not just increase pressure. Pressure without alignment creates burnout. Alignment creates sustainable speed. And that's a huge difference. That's a very huge difference. Now, here is where leadership evolution becomes critical. Most leaders think their job is making decisions. That is what most leaders think. But in modern organizations, that is only part of the job. The real responsibility of leadership is creating executable clarity, not just strategic clarity. Executable clarity means people understand what this decision changes, what behaviors should shift, what trade-offs now matter most, what actions are safe to take autonomously, what success now looks like operationally. That's a completely different from simply announcing a direction. Let me repeat that. That is completely different from simply announcing a direction. And honestly, this is why many organizations stay trapped in execution circles. They stay trapped in execution cycles. They confuse agreement with alignment. But agreement is intellectual. Alignment is operational. You can agree in a meeting while still operating from completely different assumptions. That is why execution inconsistencies appear. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Many organizations have decision-heavy cultures without having alignment-heavy systems. So leaders keep making more decisions, hoping progress accelerates. But adding decisions to a misaligned system often increases organizational friction. It's like adding more cars onto a traffic jam. The issue isn't vehicle quantity, it is traffic flow. And organizational flow depends on aligned cognition. That is why execution should never be viewed as a motivation issue first. It should be viewed as a systems alignment issue. That is how it should be viewed. So what do high-performing organizations do differently? What do they do differently? They don't just clarify decisions. No, they operationalize interpretation. This is the part most companies skip. Here are 4 things elite execution cultures consistently do. Number 1, they define decision principles before problems appear. This is huge. Instead of improvising under pressure, teams already understand what matters most, how trade-offs are evaluated, what risks are acceptable, when speed matters more than perfection. That creates confidence. Number 2, they reduce priority collisions. One of the biggest execution killers is competing expectations. If a team is told, move faster, but also minimize all risk, but also reduce costs, but also improve quality, without clarifying hierarchy, team freezes. They freeze because every decision feels politically dangerous. Strong organizations reduce strategic contradiction. They reduce that. Number 3, they reinforce behavior consistently. This is where culture actually forms. Not from posters, not from slogans, not from mission statements, but from repeated behavioral reinforcement. If leaders reward initiative publicly, people become more proactive. If leaders punish intelligent mistakes harshly, people become defensive. Organizations train behavior, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Number 4, they build execution trust. That is massive. Teams execute faster when they trust leadership consistency, decision stability, role clarity, escalation logic, cross-functional cooperation. Without trust, organizations create defensive coordination. And defensive coordination is incredibly slow. Because everybody protects themselves. Nobody moves decisively. That is why alignment isn't soft. It is operational infrastructure. Let me give you a quick test. If you want to know whether the organization has real alignment, ask these 5 questions. Question 1. Can teams explain the reasoning behind leadership decisions? Not just the decision itself, the reasoning. Question 2. Do employees know what trade-offs are acceptable without escalation? Question 3. When priorities conflict, does the organization have a clear hierarchy? Does it have a clear hierarchy? Question 4. Are managers reinforcing the same behaviors consistently across departments? Question 5. Do people feel safer acting or asking permission? That last question reveals almost everything, because organizations that over-rely on permission systems eventually lose execution speed. Not because people lack talent, but because community dependency becomes embedded into the culture. becomes embedded into the culture. And once that happens, every simple decision and even simpler ones start moving slowly. Start moving very slowly. So here is the big idea I want you to remember. Clear decisions do not automatically create execution. Aligned organizational cognition creates execution. That means people understand the decision. People interpret the decision similarly. People know how priorities shift. People understand trade-offs. People trust reinforcement systems. People feel safe acting. That is when organizations move. And honestly, that is why smaller companies outperform larger organizations. Yes, that's why smaller companies outperform larger competitors. Not because they have more resources, but because they have less cognitive friction. Everybody understands how to move. Alignment creates velocity. Misalignment creates drag. And most execution problems are really invisible drag problems. So, the next time your organization says you already made the decision, why is it anything happening? Don't immediately assume people are resistant. Ask a deeper question. Did the organization merely communicate the decision? Or did it create aligned execution logic around the decision? Because those are not the same thing. One creates temporary agreement, the other creates sustainable execution. And that difference changes everything. That difference changes everything. If this video helped you think differently about execution, alignment, and organizational decision making, make sure you subscribe because this channel is all about helping organizations eliminate execution breakdown by aligning priorities, decision making, and accountability. And I would love to hear from you in the comments. What is one decision your organization made that looked clear but still failed during execution? Because chances are the problem wasn't the decision itself, it was the alignment underneath it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.